Critical Race Consciousness is the name of the book. Reconsidering American Ideologies of Racial Justice is the subtitle. The author is Georgetown law professor Gary Peller. Professor Peller, what's your theme? What's your goal in this book?
The goal in this book is to address what I see as the critical and kind of despairing situation of the African American community at this point in American history. And the starting point is a realization that despite some symbolic gains, particularly with the election, obviously, of Barack Obama as president, that the African American community in the United States today is really in very bad straits economically, culturally, spiritually, in terms of a vision for the future, in terms of leadership. And so I set out to explore the roots of the situation. How did we get to the situation in which white liberals and progressives, traditionally the allies of African American liberation and progress, today basically are looking at the African American community and thinking, well, this isn't my job, this isn't my responsibility, the community should decide for itself. And obviously conservative leaders are begrudging the affirmative action programs and other perceived preferences that the African Americans have gotten in American society. So it seems that we're at a crisis with no way forward. And so what I set out to do is to diagnose how we got here from what I would say is an ideological point of view. What set of concepts and ideas and assumptions about race and about justice in America has led us to this stalemate and deadlock and kind of hopeless situation as I described it. So in my analysis, the roots of the current situation from an ideological point of view can be found in the confrontation in the 1960s over race, but not the conventional confrontation that people usually look to. The conventional story of racial justice and enlightenment in America describes the 1950s and 1960s as a confrontation between advocates and proponents of white supremacy, of segregation, and those of integration, of those who are looking for racial enlightenment, those who understood that race doesn't matter, it's just an arbitrary fact of individuals. But I want to focus, and I think the critical focus, obviously we know who won that confrontation, and integrationism and the liberals and progressives won out there. But there was another confrontation in the 1960s, and that one was about how exactly racial justice should be understood, how racism should be understood, and how racial justice should be understood. And that part of the confrontation in the 1960s, I think it's been neglected in today's conventional understanding of a kind of linear development of racial enlightenment. And that confrontation was within the advocates, within the community of advocates for racial justice, between those who advocated integrationism as a way to understand what racism consisted of and a way to remediate racism, versus those who advocated what I call black nationalism. These are the thought of Malcolm X, of Stokely Carmichael, his name at the time, of followers of the SNCC movement, various formations, Black Power, Black Panther Party, excuse me, one of the most famous of the black nationalist groups of the late 1960s and 1970s. And in my argument, what happened in that confrontation is that a wide spectrum of American enlightened culture interpreted the black nationalist position through a lens that saw black nationalism as equal to white supremacy. It's as if the advocates of black nationalism were just like white segregationists, and the equation was based on the idea that what they shared in common was the false and racist idea that race made a difference, that it wasn't just an arbitrary characteristic of skin color. And so in this lens, all kinds of say, arbitrary or irrational ways of thinking about people tend to become equated. So there's a norm of equal treatment and being non-discriminatory, being neutral regardless of race, that's then serves to equate the situation of racial minorities with the situation of women, with the situation of sexual minorities. Any group is similar to every other group in this respect, to the extent that they have also been discriminated against. So in this vision, racism consists in a mistaken, what I call the integrationist vision. Racism consists in a mistaken consciousness. It's rooted in people thinking the wrong thing about each other because they're making a mistake. They're being prejudiced. They're prejudging based on skin color. And then racism achieves a social form in the form of discrimination based on these wrong ideas in the head. Rather than apply equal treatment, institutions and employers discriminate. And then in this vision of integrationism, that kind of racism achieves its kind of institutional form in segregation, in the Jim Crow practices of segregation that ruled America until the 1950s or 1960s. But the black nationalist perspective, when it's not understood simply as another form of racism because it sees race to make a difference between people, the black nationalist perspective is a deep philosophical contestation of those assumptions of integrationism. And the first contestation, and probably the most important one from my perspective, is contesting the idea that there's a neutral, rational, aracial way to perceive each other. That neutrality is a real possibility. And so the very idea of racism consisting in a mistake of consciousness is contested in the black nationalist perspective by a different historical view of racism. Racism consists in the maldistribution of power, prestige, and wealth between races in America. And then its social form, rather than imagining a non-existent way to simply treat everyone equally regardless of race, the social form of racism is then understood as a mass subordination of one group to another. And the solution to that subordination is not equal treatment. The solution is reparations. The solution is an end to that maldistribution of wealth, power, and prestige. And then on an institutional form, just as integrationism saw the institutional form of its individualized, consciousness-based view of racism as being segregation, the black nationalist position imagines that what's really going on is similar to one nation colonizing another nation. So African Americans in the literature of the late 1960s and early 1970s, black nationalists were conceptualized as forming an internal colony in the United States that was administered by an external kind of occupying force. What I think is particularly appealing about the black nationalist position is its starting point assumption that race really does matter. I think it's a false assumption of integrationism that largely was apologetic about existing social practices to understand racism in a relatively superficial way, as simply a mistake of consciousness, a form of irrationality, as opposed to understand racial power more deeply inscribed in the institutional practices and customs and mores of our society. The black nationalist position understands race to connote a difference akin to a difference in nationality between communities. The African American community has had a separate history from white Americans in North America. They've had a particular history, much of it as subordination, but within that subordination have created a community, a culture, mores that are worth preserving, as opposed to the deep integrationist assumption as criticized by the black nationalists of the late 1960s and 1970s that basically imagines the black community should cease to exist once integrationism succeeds, that there will be a kind of, in the words of Robert Williams, a painless genocide as African Americans are integrated into mainstream and majority white institutions. So that's the thesis in a nutshell, that good and well-intentioned people in 1960s and 1970s embraced a vision of racial justice that limited the amount that would need to be reformed in American society. So for example, in legal education, I started teaching at the University of Virginia School of Law. The University of Virginia was a segregated institution by law through until the late 1960s. It was part of the never say die segregationist resistance of the state of Virginia. When I got there in the early 80s, the school had been integrated, at least formally integrated. There was no racial exclusion. But integration was understood